My father was born in a small town called Bar in Ukraine. That was the time of upsurge of the pogroms in the Ukraine, where all the Jewish people were being massacred in about 1920. He was in a Jewish family who all spoke Yiddish. My father was educated, and somehow he was the only one who could speak Russian. So he either joined or was conscripted into the Russian army when he was 19 years old. He was put to guard the border one night when he smuggled the entire family out of Ukraine into Poland and then via France and made it to St. Louis. It took over a year to do, but they had a relative who sponsored them in St. Louis. So he came to St. Louis, Missouri, and became educated as a pharmacist at St. Louis College of Pharmacy, and then went into the business of owning and running a drugstore. My mother's family originally came also from Ukraine, and they lived in small town Mayfield, Kentucky, where my grandfather, whom I never met, was a shoemaker, a clothing salesman, low-level entrepreneur, one of only 2 Jewish families in Mayfield, Kentucky. They had to go to St. Louis to obtain supplies for their businesses, and as I see the story, that's where my mom and dad met. We lived above the drugstore. It was across the street from a major hospital. There were streetcar tracks on both sides. There were no television. Probably my most interesting activity was looking out the window at the streetcars. There was no air conditioning. He would close the drugstore, and we would go to Forest Park, one of the major parks in St. Louis, watching the fountain in the park until it cooled off a little bit. He had criteria that I couldn't breach, and sometimes I never understood. But the older I've gotten and the more I know about his background and what he went through, I've become a lot more tolerant than the rebellious teenager that I was. So my mother was the sweetest country girl you would ever meet. I couldn't go outside and eat a popsicle if I didn't have one for all the other kids. There was no concept of not sharing. My father told me when I was in junior high school that he was in poor health and that he would never really be able to support my going to college. So if I had any aspirations of getting an advanced education, I'd have to pay for it myself. But at that point, about 8th grade, I had to shift to getting good enough grades that I could get through on scholarship. I have still never worked as hard as I did at University City High School. It was nothing to stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning finishing homework and then get to school early. I started first working in a drugstore chain when I was 16. It was my exposure to dealing with the public and dealing with people. The drugstore had a soda fountain, and many of the employees of the hospital would come to the drugstore for lunch. And there were very prominent doctors who came and prominent surgeons. One of them, Dr. J.J. Thomas, couldn't sit at the soda fountain because he was African American. I would take him his lunch in the stock room, and we would sit on boxes and talk. I was a student in science. I was never hell-bent on going into medicine, but I talked about it. And Dr. Thomas told me, if you're ever interested in medicine, don't be a pre-med student, because that will just cast you into vicious competition. Study what you like. Be good at what you want to do. In your last year, apply to medical school. And I took his advice, and it worked beautifully. I was a good student. I had good grades, and I had applied to some significant Ivy League colleges, and they had an interview process. And I was in high school, and it was a big room with a lot of important people sitting around the table. And I went in, and they started asking me questions, and I started giving them answers. And it's hard to believe I actually did this. But this was in the 50s, and a lot of the questions had to do with my religion. And there were quotas in those days. And as we drifted into that area, I said, I don't think you're interested in me, and I'm sure as hell not interested in you. So that pretty well cooked my goose for the Ivy League schools. And I went to Washington University, and it was mostly local people from the St. Louis area. The entire chemistry and physics department had been recruited from the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. I concentrated mostly on the sciences, and to make things even better, freshman year, I met the girl who would be my wife. As Barbara and I were looking to get married and have a family, it was clear that she was going to be earning money and I probably wouldn't for quite a while. But with my background in chemistry, I found that a job became open at Monsanto Chemical Company, which was stationed in St. Louis at that time. And it was $350 a month, more money than I ever imagined possible. And I worked for an incredible physical chemist named Ed Griffith. He was probably the smartest person I've ever known. His tie was always pulled down, his shirt was unbuttoned, usually was smoking a cheap cigar. And I learned more about dealing with human beings from Ed. He said, when you talk to people, you speak in terms of wheelbarrows, not molecules. So I applied to medical school, Washington University in St. Louis. I had to go through the interview procedure. It was a Saturday morning at the medical school. It was another room full of important people sitting around a big table. And the person who went in before me came out sweating, upset. He was shattered. I said, I was a pretty good chemist. I don't think I'm going to have to put up with this too much. I went in there kind of loaded for bear. He said, what would you say if we offer you a scholarship? And I said, you got yourself a medical student. Barbara and I had family in St. Louis, and that was where we decided we were going to go. We went to undergraduate school, we did a lot together, and we decided to get married before medical school. So we were married in August before I started medical school in September. It was very rigorous. The announcement came that President Kennedy had been assassinated. And we had a neuroanatomy exam the next day. And the professor said, well, we're still going to have the exam. So with all of the turmoil in the country at that time, we still had our neuroanatomy exam. When I did my first surgical rotation, I met the chief resident, and there's a very old lady on the bed screaming epithets about the very dark-skinned African-American man who was holding her down so she wouldn't fall off the table. The chief resident looks around and he says, okay, Ira, this is your first case, and he walks out. The orderly was Mr. Charles Carroll. And he said, Doc, put those gloves on and I'll tell you what to do and you're going to be okay. So he told me how to suture a laceration, how to dress it, how to do everything. That was the beginning of my surgical career. I had an advantage over most of my classmates. When the other folks were competing with each other and they just couldn't stand the pressure of medical school, I went home and had dinner with Barb. I said, all right, if this doesn't work, Monsanto's there. They'll take me back. So I did well in medical school, but I always had the relief of knowing that I had family to go back to. It was a time of the Vietnam War. All doctors were being drafted. We knew that we were going to go in. So a program came up called the Senior Medical Student Program, where if I joined, when I finished my internship, I owed the Army 3 years instead of the usual 2 for which other doctors were being drafted. Shortly after we signed the contract was the Tet Offensive. So now most of us were going to Vietnam, especially with any surgery training. One of my surgical mentors, who later became one of my partners when I returned, he said there was one opening in Germany for a doctor, and if we got our paperwork in that night, we had a chance to be assigned to Germany. So Barb and I stayed up most of the night, got the paperwork in, and when the time came, we were in fact assigned to a place called Baumholder, Germany. We did 6 weeks of so-called basic training in San Antonio, and they didn't teach us anything about how to be in the Army and be a soldier. When we got to Germany, I was the second ranking officer in this artillery battalion. You know, we had like 700 men. There was a lieutenant colonel, there was one captain, I was the other captain, and the other officers were lieutenants. I think it stood me in good stead dealing with surgery in later years. We traveled a lot from this little place called Baumholder, and some of our travels involved medical meetings. So there was a big medical meeting in Bavaria. We were bused from the meeting back to the hotel. And Barb and I were on the bus, and there were 2 full colonels sitting behind us. And one said to the other, "You know what I need is a young surgeon that wants to work his ass off. Nobody in my hospital wants to work." He said, turned around and said, "Excuse me, sir, where are you from?" He said, "Berlin." I said, "I'm your guy." And we were assigned to Berlin. We, the Allies, had jurisdiction over the last remaining Nazi prisoner. Rudolf Hess was in Spandau prison, this huge castle prison. Rudolf Hess was second in command to Hitler. So the Allied forces would meet every quarter to discuss the health of Rudolf Hess. It was always an internist who saw him. In the time that I went, it was Fred Mazer, who was a Jewish guy from the East Coast. And I asked him, I said, "When you spoke to Rudolf Hess, you know, what did you say to each other?" Fred said, "I asked him how his health was. We went over symptoms, and that was it. There was no cordial exchange." So we returned to St. Louis in 1971. I had only done 1 year of surgery internship. My residency in surgery at Jewish Hospital was waiting for me. We had a very dignified, very pompous surgeon named Sam Schneider. He took me to the basement of Deaconess Hospital. It was one of our community hospitals in St. Louis. And it turned out that this was a total self-help group. There were no enterostomal therapists. There were no nurse specialists. There was no place that sold supplies. They had to order ostomy supplies and get them in brown envelopes because they didn't want any of the neighbors to know that they had a colostomy or an ileostomy. That was the switch. That's what I wanted to do. And that's colon and rectal surgery. We had a woman named Eleanor Sturm who had an ileostomy herself. And Eleanor became the first enterostomal therapist in St. Louis. She and I conjured a way to have a clinic, a night clinic at the hospital for ostomy patients. There's no organized ostomy care at all in St. Louis at this time. The night before the ostomy clinic started, Dr. Schneider had a massive stroke from which he never recovered. So he never knew what he had created. Patients came in, and that first night we had a man who couldn't stand his colostomy, tried to shoot it off with a gun. We had any of the patients who had stomas, there were very little in the way of appliances. They would take a tuna fish can and stuff it with Kleenex and tape it to their abdomen. That was their appliance. And it was clear that we were way in over our heads. Went to Dr. Bowie the next day and said, we need psychologists, we need social work. So Dr. Bowie called Rupert Turnbull at the Cleveland Clinic to see if he would take me as a fellow. In those days, obtaining fellows in colon and rectal surgery was like horse trading. There were no matching programs. There was no organization. If you could get a willing person and wine and dine them for a night, and sign them up, then you had a body to do the work. So Barb and I drove to Cleveland, and I met Dr. Turnbull, and he invited me to dinner, not Barb, at the elegant cafeteria within the Cleveland Clinic. And he told me that the opening was for the coming year, not the next year. So I said, so the bottom fell out of everything for us. So I did what we usually did in times of stress. We found a restaurant that served lobster in Cleveland, and Barb and I had a lobster dinner without Turnbull, and said, we'll have to do what we can do. So it turned out that Dr. Bowie made the arrangements because of my time in the Army. I had a year's credit in general surgery, I had a year's credit in orthopedic surgery, so he moved up my chief residency year. Going to the fellowship was interesting because they had packed the moving van, but they wouldn't close the door to the moving van because we were so poor that they weren't sure that they were going to get paid for the trip to Cleveland. So I had to call the Department of Surgery at Jewish Hospital, and they sent one of the faculty, Tom Covey, to bring a check from the Mannheimer Fund at Jewish Hospital so they would close the moving van and take us to Cleveland. I was part of a community, and it was that community in which I worked and who supported me. We went to Cleveland. It was a very busy program. Rupert Turnbull was one of the most skilled surgeons I had ever seen. Vic Fazio, Malcolm Goldsmith, and Ian Cunningham had finished the year before me. My co-fellows were David Jagelman, Peter Wilk, and then Ian Lavery joined us at mid-year. It was incredible. Turnbull's service alone would run as many as 100 patients. We had to keep a whole team out of the operating room every day just to make rounds. Turnbull's training was to operate as if you were the end of the road. There's no place that's going to bail you out. You have to do it. And that was how he taught us to operate and how to take care of patients. During the latter part of my training in Cleveland, Stanley Goldberg from Minnesota took it upon himself to recruit surgeons, including some of the younger surgeons, to think about starting training programs. And the organization within which he worked was the American Society of Colon and Rectal Surgeons. So I was introduced at a very early part of my career working with the ASCRS and in thinking about creating our own fellowship program in St. Louis at Washington University. I returned to St. Louis and joined the private practice group in 1975 that had recruited me when I was an intern. I was the only colon and rectal surgeon in the group, and there was only one other comparable colon and rectal surgeon in St. Louis, and he wanted to have nothing to do with the educational part of it. This is the transition time, where if you said you were a colon and rectal surgeon, they assumed that you were a proctologist, because that's all there was. I knew that what I had learned in Cleveland about the disease processes and how to operate and how to deal with the patients was so far above what our norm was that it became my interest and life quest to get colon and rectal surgeons into our major teaching institutions. And that really set a lot of my ambitions with the ASCRS. It was everything that I wanted to do. I wanted to grow the organization because when I finished at Cleveland, I knew what was good colon and rectal surgery. I knew what the world needed, and I knew that the world didn't have it. So when I returned to Washington University, I was in private practice, and I still had the dream of creating an academic program in colon and rectal surgery, at Washington University. And the time had come that I had to meet with the chief of surgery, Dr. Walter Ballinger. So I made the appointment, went into his office, pled my case, and Dr. Ballinger said, I don't believe in colon and rectal surgery, and I think you should leave my office now and never come back. He threw me out of his office. So away I went, still with a dream. And as years went by, Dr. Ballinger and I became good friends. In 1980, we started our fellowship, and we were, I think, the first fully university-affiliated fellowship program in colon and rectal surgery. And Dr. Wells came on as chief of surgery at Washington University. He was amenable to having us join the faculty. It was Bob Fry and I, and we were in this private practice situation. And Sam Wells hired us. It was my intro coming into Washington University under Dr. Wells into dealing with the academic surgical hierarchy. When I made the approach to Washington University to build a fellowship program, remember now, the fellowship program would be the stepping stone to having a real academic program in colon and rectal surgery. It was easier to sell the fact that we were training surgeons to go to other institutions in the country to provide the very best clinical care they could for patients. The major hospital was Barnes Hospital. We were a Jewish hospital. They were separate unless they got into trouble. When something was going on that was disastrous, they would either get us operating privileges, temporary, or we would transfer the patient to the Jewish hospital side where we could take care of them. And that became our reputation. If anybody had trouble, we'll get you out. No holds barred. And that's how we built the program. And finally, the hospitals merged. When the hospitals merged, the endowment at Jewish Hospital was 4 times that of the much larger Barnes Hospital. My brother was an art dealer, and he was friends with one of the very prominent families in St. Louis who were aiming a professorship in surgery to me. At the last minute, it got shifted to plastic surgery by Dr. Wells. Dr. Wells and I didn't get along very well. A few months went by, and one of the gastroenterologists with whom I worked from the very beginning, Dr. Burton Schatz, invited me to lunch with him and a real estate mogul in St. Louis, Solon Gershman. So my father, who was a pharmacist, in his later years, he ended up showing houses for a real estate company. That was Solon Gershman. My dad worshipped him. So Bert Schatz, Solon Gershman, I ordered at the St. Louis Club, ordered lunch. I'll never forget, I ordered a bison burger. And by the time they delivered the bison burger, Solon said to Bert Schatz, "Do you think $750,000 would help?" I said, I couldn't eat my bison burger. He started it. They had a reception at one of the other prominent people in St. Louis house to introduce the professorship. He said, Betty and I discussed the fact we don't think 750 is an even number, so we're going to make it 1 million. How's that? It was the second colon and rectal surgery endowed chair in the country. Randa Carey in Chicago had the first, and I had the second. One of the most important things that happened with the ASCRS was establishing liaison with the American Board of Surgery. We were actually a certified board before general surgery. And the American Board of Surgery didn't want to give full recognition to these proctologists who were doing hemorrhoids. There was a lot of hostility in this because the general surgery community saw themselves being eaten up. They actually had cartoons in their publications of all the specialty organizations attacking, the poor lamb of general surgery, wanting to tear it apart. It had nothing to do with the fact that we were more experienced, we had better results, the patients did better, but it was a political football that was tossed around. And the ice was broken in the days of Mike Weidenheimer from Leahy Clinic, where the American Board of Surgery would have a representative from the American Board of Colon and Rectal Surgery be on their board of directors for a 6-year stint. For our little section in St. Louis, I followed Mike Weidenheimer, Bob Fry followed me, Jim Fleshman followed Bob. So for 18 years, the liaison with the American Board of Surgery came from Washington University section of Colon and Rectal Surgery. The Board of Surgery wanted every surgeon to be certified by the American Board of Surgery before they took any specialty certification. Our ancestors, the folks that brought me up in this, said, that's a good idea, and they voted to do it. But they tabled it for years because it was a secondary object that they wanted us to fulfill. It changed with Dr. Wheeler, who did a study on what the facts were, looking at what they called index cases. So these were the hard, difficult operations that a surgery resident would do. When Wheeler's results came out, the American Board of Surgery came to us and said, okay, we would like for you now to come into the academic institutions and train our residents. And that's how we came to link the certification. So everybody who's board certified now in colon and rectal surgery is also board certified in general surgery. I wanted the best care for the patients in the United States. And my way of doing it was to get training programs in every university institution and to get us published in the literature. Stan Goldberg started some of this. He was well published in the textbooks. We were fortunate enough in St. Louis, we wrote all the colon and rectal chapters in Schwartz textbook of surgery. That was the standard. Bob and Jim and I, we did 3 SEBA clinical symposia. These reached out. They distributed hundreds of thousands of these worldwide, and we've seen some of our publications come back in Japanese. But that was my quest. I fulfilled my quest. As I aspired to become a leader in the organization, I served as a secretary for, I think, at least 6 years, might be a record holder for the longest secretary in existence. But I learned to meet the people, and I learned how the system worked. So in 1997, I became president of the American Society of Colon and Rectal Surgeons. The most important thing I did is that I would travel to the academic programs and I would teach the residents about colon and rectal surgery, representing the ASCRS. They only invited me because I was president of the ASCRS. When I got there, I took the opportunity to teach them the advantages of really being trained as a specialist in colon and rectal surgery. And if I couldn't convert them all to be colon and rectal surgeons, but I could show them what good colon and rectal surgery was. The way I feel about what I've done, and if there's anything that I would want to pass on, is just to be nice to people. Hire nice people. Work with nice people whenever you can. And be nice to them yourselves. Reach out. Take the best care of patients you possibly can. And respect all of your students. Be good teachers. Be good surgeons. Be good parents. And be nice. The ASCRS meetings, we met nice people. They were nice to us. They included us. They inspired us to keep going. And the litany of our history, the Norman Nigros, the Sullivans, the Stan Goldbergs, the Haran Abkarians, that's why we are what we are. These were people who cared not about themselves, but about sharing and building. Building for young people. It was like planting the seed for a tree that we're never going to see. So I think it's important. So this is my partner, Barbara. We've been dating since 1959. 60. And as of this August, we will have been married 60 years. And everything that I get credit for comes from her.